All right, so we're going to try to finish up French Revolution Notes 1. This will be the bottom of the page. It says July 1790 to July 1791. I think I already talked a little bit about Louis being forced to sign the civil constitution of the clergy. That was a big deal because what it did was it eliminated the power of the Catholic Church, and it forced priests to take an oath to the National Assembly before they took an oath to the Pope. That was pretty offensive to a lot of the priests who, took their vows seriously to the Catholic Church, and it created a big division in the, among the priests in France. Generally speaking, the priests who took the oath to the National Assembly were the priests who didn't really take their jobs particularly seriously to begin with. Many of these folks were in the cities. Many of them had been, corrupt or whatever. Then the guys who refused to take the oath to the civil constitution of the clergy, like I said to you before, they were called refractory or non-juring priests. And many of them were out in the countryside, and they really did view their religion as important in their life. And it turned out to be a major bone of contention later on. And a lot of these guys who didn't take the oath to the National Assembly over the Pope were eventually later killed, but that's a different story. So let's move on to the next bullet point, which is the elderly aunts. What I mean by the elderly aunts is these are the elderly aunts of the king, Louis XVI. In April of 1791, they ask if they can go to Rome to celebrate Easter with the Pope. And that seems like a pretty valid kind of very religious thing to ask of the National Assembly. But the National Assembly actually denies them the trip to Rome to celebrate Easter with the Pope. And the reason why the National Assembly denies them the trip is that they're afraid that these aunts will be carrying a message to the Pope to rally Catholic countries to come in and defeat the National Assembly. So the paranoia is starting to ratchet up. By April of 1791, in the National Assembly is even suspicious of these old women going to Rome because they're really, really afraid that if they get to Rome, that the Pope might, get together a bunch of Catholic leaders and armies and come in and defeat the National Assembly and restore King Louis XVI to the throne. Similarly, in the same month, April of 1791, the king asks if he can take a trip to St. Cloud to celebrate Easter. St. Cloud is near the border of France and Austria. And this trip is denied by the National Assembly as well. They thought that his asking to go to St. Cloud to celebrate Easter was a pretense of his trying to escape over the border into Austria, raise an army with his wife, Marie Antoinette's family, and come back and defeat the National Assembly. So again, the paranoia is on edge by early 1791, and they deny the king and his family a trip to St. Cloud to celebrate Easter. And the whole point of the elderly aunts to Rome and the whole point of talking about the trip to St. Cloud is that this shows you that the National Assembly wasn't really, confident in the king sticking around and being part of the new government at this point. And then finally, in June 1791, the king decides that he is going to flee the country and try to get to Austria and try to escape the country and maybe raise an army and come back and restore himself to the throne. So in June of 1791, the king and his family plan an elaborate escape from Paris to Austria. The way it kind of shakes out is kind of interesting. The king, in preparation for this escape, had some tailors make some clothes that made him appear to be a servant and made his family appear to be lower level than, monarchs certainly, and lower than nobility. He had it pretty well planned out. He had fresh horses ready for him to pull the carriage all the way along the route in his escape to Austria. And these fresh horses were supposed to be available and ready to go so that he could go at, breakneck speed all the way from Paris to his eventual hope being, all the way to Austria. There's a couple of things that are kind of goofy about the way he planned this thing out. Number one, he was riding in a carriage that was much too elaborate for a peasant or somebody who appeared to be a peasant or at least a third estater to be riding in. So that raised maybe some suspicion. And the other thing is he had a passport that was signed by the king, and most people's passports were not obviously signed by the king. So to have a passport signed by the king meant, that you were a pretty special person. And obviously the king at the time could sign passports, but, when people asked to look at his papers, it did raise an eyebrow that his passport was signed by the king. And then finally, some people actually did recognize him by his appearance. So even with the disguise on, he was eventually recognized by a National Guardsman, and the National Guardsman alerted his people. They actually did not stop the king until he was already in Varennes, which is really close to the Austrian border. So it was really close for him to escape. And he almost made it, but eventually he was discovered, and he, Marie Antoinette, and the kids and a few servants were dragged back to Paris. So I guess the thing that this flight to Varennes is really important for is maybe two things. Number one, the people were pretty certain now that the king had, abandoned them, that he had no real intention of being part of this new government, and that he, wanted out. So that was pretty obvious. Number two, it allowed the people to drag him back to Paris, and he was now actually a prisoner of Paris, and he was a bargaining chip, right? So, they basically, were able to hold him hostage when other countries threatened him. So, for instance, later on, Austria and Prussia declare war against the National Assembly, and he and his wife, who is an Austrian, are a pretty good bargaining chip. In the sense that if you go any farther, we'll do harm to the royal family or whatever. So he was a political bargaining chip after Varennes. He also had lost the confidence in the National Assembly, but the National Assembly and a lot of the people in France lost confidence in the king after his flight in 1791. So it was a really important event in the history of the French Revolution. And then finally, the king's flight to Varennes, combined with the next event, Lafayette firing on the mob in Champ de Mars, was kind of the end of the moderate phase of the revolution. So what happened at Champ de Mars was that many of the revolutionaries who were kind of inclined for more progress, a more liberal approach to France, started to kind of riot, very similar to the mobs and the riots that were in some of the cities in the United States this summer. And so the mob started to become violent, and they started to pillage. And eventually Lafayette was kind of forced to make a decision. He either had to put down the mob, or he had to kind of condone a level of violence even beyond the level of violence that he had been condoning up to this point. He eventually decided enough was enough, and he fired on the mob at Champ de Mars. And when he did this, it basically alienated him, a moderate, to the more liberal sentiments of the revolution. And so that's a big deal in the sense that the paranoia of the king's flight and the alienation of the liberal factions against Lafayette types made the revolution kind of descend into a much more liberal / radical phase. So it's not like the perfect wave is over. The perfect wave is still building towards this really violent kind of cataclysmic, radical phase of the revolution that's about to come. But that's it for French Revolution Notes 1. If you have any questions, you come see me or we can talk on our office hours. Thanks.